My name's Jane Seale. I'm a professor at the Open University, and in my presentation I'd like to share with you my thoughts on how disability practitioners can support the development of accessibility practice across their institutions. What I'd like to focus on is practice that supports disabled students to access technologies that facilitate and enhance their learning experience and outcomes. And by technologies, I mean pretty much anything goes. So university websites, online library databases, any online course that a student's required to engage in, computer labs, plus any assistive technologies that students might need to support their learning. And I'm coming at this from my perspective, not as a disability practitioner, but as a researcher and an observer of practice. And I'd like to draw on two projects in my talk. One is something called the EdICT International Network that I led, and another is my kind of thinking and writing around what I've called Socratic gadflies. And in particular, what I'd like to do through sharing with you these two projects is offer a framework for conceptualising what impactful practice might look like. So the first project that I'm going to draw on and that will underpin what I talk about is the EdICT International Network, and it was funded by the Leverhulme Foundation. And it was basically a core network of 15 partners from across 5 countries: America, Canada, Germany, Israel and the UK. And over 2 years we visited each of those 5 countries, and in each country we drew together a community of 20 or more people, and those people included disabled students, faculty, academics, service providers like yourself, disability practitioners, support and advocacy organisations, tech companies and researchers. And each time we met, we'd have a particular theme, and one of the themes I think is particularly pertinent to the conference that we're all attending here is the theme of stakeholder engagement. And what we were really exploring is who are the stakeholders of disability and ICT practice in higher education, and how can these stakeholders be effectively engaged in order to improve practice. And when we were having those conversations and those discussions, we were really drawing on a critical framework, if you like, and one bits of that framework was my stakeholder model for accessibility practice that I developed back in 2006. And essentially what I was trying to argue then and get people to kind of conceptualise and see is that, first of all, there was a range of stakeholders. It wasn't just the lecturer and the student that were part of the community, if you like. It was learning technologists, disability practitioners, staff developers, senior managers, the whole lot, so to speak. But also that their practice was mediated and driven, where the drivers might be legislation, it might be guidelines, it might be standards such as WCAG and so on. And it was mediated by things like our views and perceptions of disability, our views and perceptions about inclusion, segregation, and also whose responsibility is this thing called accessibility practice. And I was also very much influenced by the work of Etienne Wenger, who I'm sure we're all familiar with, and this idea of communities of practice. And particularly what I liked was the notion that if we're in a community, we have a shared enterprise, we're all after the same thing, a shared goal. And part of trying to achieve that shared goal is drawing on a similar or same set of tools and ideas. So the second project that I'm going to draw on is more a kind of thinking project than a doing project. But it was writings of mine where I've really picked on this idea of being a Socratic gadfly, which sounds a bit strange, but if you think of a gadfly as maybe not quite so mean as a bee or a wasp that might sting, but it definitely has a bit of a poke, if you like, that prodding, provoking kind of aspect, where the provoking is about trying to persuade stakeholders to see something other than their own view of the world, something which I think is really important in the communities that we're working in. But also the Socratic aspect of what I was picking up on in this notion of Socratic gadfly is about being political, seeking to turn voices of silence into voices of change. So in my writings, I was targeting researchers, but I think what I'm saying does apply to you as disability practitioners. This kind of argument that we need to rethink our roles in order to critically examine who doesn't have a voice in our field, and who's being silent. And I don't mean always because they're silenced. It might be because they're deliberately deciding not to say something. In other words, not challenging unhelpful assumptions. So part of this idea of critical and Socratic gadflies is really underpinned by Paulo Freire's work on pedagogy of the oppressed, the idea that in order for learners to be agents, if you like, to take agency and control over their learning, there needs to be a dialogue, an interactive two-way conversation with teachers, and teachers actually need to actively listen. So it's that kind of dialogue aspect I'm picking up in particular, but also this idea that we need to question the taken for granted assumptions in our field, things that we assume are true, they're fact, but actually are just not problematized or questioned. And because they're not questioned, we're not voicing any new possibilities. We kind of keep going over the same old ground, and that kind of stops us thinking about future directions. So with that framework and drawing on those two kind of projects, I really want to identify and flesh out a bit more what I see as three key roles for disability practitioners. One is about brokering connections, the other is about building capacity for self-advocacy, and the third is about collecting evidence to help us all question those taken for granted assumptions about what will work in our field. So if we think about brokering connections first of all, the first thing particularly that the international network of stakeholders identified was the need for practitioners, particularly those in service roles like disability practitioners, to kind of engage in what was called strategic silo crossing, where you kind of wangle it, you negotiate, you find ways whereby you and your team get invited to sit on the teams, the committee groups, the kind of the meetings of other teams within your organisation that have some role to play in accessibility. But also that's reciprocal, that you invite those people into your teams, into your meetings, so that you have the same group of people looking at a problem, but are aware of those agendas that are happening in other parts of the university. The second thing that I think is really important in terms of brokering connections is making connections with important but invisible stakeholders. One of the things I've identified in this field, particularly thinking about accessible online learning or access to technology, is that the same old people are identified, and they might be the right people, such as lecturers, librarians, learning technologists, but there are people who are ignored, who we just don't talk about, but they're really important. So we need to make connections with them. And one group is those in our universities and colleges who are responsible for procurement, for actually buying and procuring the technologies that we're expecting our students to use. And they seem to be an invisible stakeholder that we need to engage with. I would suggest that admissions teams are important. Part of what we want to do is to, in that widening participation inclusion agenda, is to encourage disabled students to come and learn with us, and the admissions team are part of that process. So they need to be aware of how to make their admissions material accessible and inclusive, but also what they can be saying and explaining and describing that would persuade students that we're a good place to come in terms of being inclusive. And careers advisors is another important one. One really under-researched and under-problematized area that was identified in the network was the issue of transition to work, where disabled students and others were saying, look, it's all very well you offering me this fabulous stuff at university, but when I go to work, that's all lost. My employers just haven't got a clue. So it seems to me there is work there for careers advisors, careers teams, and all the people engaged in that community to create connections between employers and students, so that any positive practice that's learnt, any positive experience can be transferred over, and that we support that to happen. The second area that I think disability practitioners do have an important role is building capacity for self-advocacy, particularly of disabled students. And this notion of collectivism, there being power in a collectivism, encouraging this group of stakeholders to interact and network with one another, so that they can advocate for their rights and support needs. And I would suggest that there's no coincidence that in the UK in particular, there's no public legal case that exists in the UK that compels universities to act on or comply with the equality legislation. And that's very different, for example, to the US, where there are very public cases brought by advocacy groups, brought by that collectivism that has compelled universities to act. And I think disability practitioners have a role in contributing to that kind of practice and that kind of discussion around what do we need here. But also I think disability practitioners can help understand why disabled students might be reluctant to become active agents of change. We all know that there are issues around fear of stigma. We know that the effort of advocating and self-advocating is exhausting, and we need to think about that. And we also know that quite a lot of students that we support want to succeed without appearing to need that extra support. They want to succeed on their own like other students do, in quotes. And part of building capacity for self-advocacy is understanding where a student's coming from. If a student's just newly acquired a label of disability, then they won't have years of experience of advocating for themselves or others. And so that might be a part of why they're silent in university. But also, if a student has had a disability label for a long time, for example, when it started at school or earlier, then the chances are that their parents were their advocates and their parents did a lot of advocating for them. And parents get a bad rap, but actually most parents do an incredible job of advocating on behalf of their child, of the student. But what does that feel like for a student who comes to university and suddenly that parental advocate is gone? How do they then, if you like, take over the mantle? And there may be a role for us through our transition programs to think about that. And certainly I would point us to University of Washington. The work of Cheryl Bergstaller, for example, has done fabulous work on helping disabled students to self-advocate and develop those skills. Disability practitioners might also have a role in providing space and opportunity for other stakeholders who may feel powerless. And I would suggest that a large group are actually disabled staff within a university who, again, I would suggest are quite invisible and may welcome those connections that disability practitioners might make. So the final area that I think disability practitioners can make a really important contribution is in collecting evidence that can help us really question unhelpful assumptions. And we have lots of assumptions about what works and what doesn't work in this field of inclusion, particularly around accessibility practice. It's pervasive and it's often unproven and taken for granted. And I use universal design as one of those examples, not because I'm against universal design. I actually think it's very powerful and it's got a lot going for it. But in the community, we kind of present it as a magical solution, as the only solution. And very often we don't question it, and very often we don't look for that robust evidence to support it. And so it kind of becomes unhelpful and therefore not the magical solution that some of us might hope it could be. We all know there are other kind of unhelpful things that happen in universities, particularly this idea around that inclusive or accessible practice requires us to treat all students the same. So therefore, if we're not treating non-disabled students the same as disabled students, somehow that's unfair and we can't do it. And that's really unhelpful and does need questioning and unpicking. A lot of those in senior positions, but not always, often say, oh, we don't need to think about this, we don't have a problem in our institution. And that's because they're looking at data that seems to show that there isn't a problem. But it might be we've got a lack of data because there's a lack of disclosure. We know there's underrepresentation of disabled students within universities. It might be that we're just not looking for a problem, so we don't find one. And particularly in Russell Group universities in the UK, there is an unhelpful assumption that in research-intensive universities, there's no problem because disabled students go to the teaching-intensive universities. That's where they'll be best looked after, if you like, and that's actually not true either. So there may need to be some kind of cracking of assumptions, if you like. I do think disability practitioners have a role to play in collecting evidence, but also understanding what will move stakeholders to action. And what moves academics to action is the kind of evidence that they value, and they'll often talk about kind of robustness and objectivity, evidence that feels like research evidence, if you like. Disability practitioners often have research skills, but may not be in that space where they feel that they can kind of undergo those kind of formal research projects. But I would suggest that what you are in a place to do and to offer is detailed, rich case studies, and they exist in research as well as practice. But case studies where there's transparent communication about how the cases were chosen, how they were developed, and that there's an overarching analysis. There is that kind of top-level inquiry about the case studies, rather than cherry-picking case studies that help you make a point, that broader kind of inquiry where you're having if you like, an objective look at practice and at experience. So what I'm trying to say is capture those stories that you're probably capturing already, but package it differently as an inquiry rather than a crusade. And linked to that, I would argue that when you're collecting evidence to try and move people to action, look at the problem from all angles. Often particular stakeholders, not just disability practitioners, any stakeholder group, will only look at a problem from its perspective. But I would suggest that it's helpful to present evidence that looks at a problem from all kinds of angles and that is not obviously designed to come to a particular conclusion. It'll come as no surprise to you when I say that managers are led to action by a particular kind of evidence, and that evidence is often evidence that's linked to policy drivers, things that affects their funding or their status in league tables in the community. And attainment gaps might be one of those, for example. So most of you will have access to institutional quantitative data. So use it, or find those allies who can help you use it, and link it to the policy narratives, and be political in the sense that compare it to who you know are your competitor organisations. Such and such institution down the road is doing this, why aren't we? This might require you to collaborate with others who've got the expertise, but it doesn't mean that you can't take ownership of the inquiry. So see where that takes you. So in conclusion, I guess my overarching kind of advice is that I kind of have a sense that disability practitioners risk not being listened to because the stakeholders you're working with think they know what you're going to say already. And that's because for a long time you and me and others in the field have pointed to things like the moral imperative for inclusion, that somehow, that it's important to think about students' rights, and that discrimination surely isn't right. We've been doing that since 2001, 1995, and that's not worked. Practice has not revolutionised. So we have to find another imperative, if you like. Otherwise, I think we'll just be accused of, that broken record syndrome, but also be accused of just being too evangelical. So going back to the idea of Socratic gadflies, my conclusion, my final call to us is to say the same thing. I'm not saying that what we're saying is wrong, but I think we have to package it differently, more powerfully, with a political voice. And I don't mean political in the sense of partisan lobbying, if you like, but political in just being aware of what other voices are out there, how we can build a cacophony of collective questioning voices that might require that strategic silo crossing, might require that capacity building for self-advocacy, might require that kind of canny collection of evidence in a way that perhaps you haven't done before. So I hope you found that useful, and if any of you want to contact me outside of the conference, please do. jane.seale@open.ac.uk. Thank you very much.